I want to really focus my talk tonight on the Gender Recognition Act and the impact on children. And as an organisation, what we look at are two areas, education and health, because the proposed changes to the Gender Recognition Act will make massive changes in those areas. And I noticed that on the consultation document, there's a little box that says, quite boldly, children will not be put at risk. So from this consultation, whatever they decide to do, children will not be put at risk. I challenged that. Everything that we know will put women at risk will, of course, is magnified when you think of girls. So you think of young girls going into a swimming pool, changing room, and seeing an adult penis. I mean, and when Karen talks about the women who've experienced male violence, or the case of rapists in women's prisons, those rapists will be released one day, and go into toilets and changing rooms, and will have full legal access to those toilets and changing rooms where women and young girls will be present. The women who have experienced male violence and sexual abuse also have to use those toilets and changing rooms. Those high street services where they all deserve to feel safe. They don't stop being traumatised when they're out of the refuge. So what the government are saying is that the children will not be put at risk because the government is not proposing to lower the age at which a child can get a gender recognition certificate from 18 to 16. Now, all the trans youth support organisations are urging their supporters to fill in the consultation and demand that that age is lowered to 16. I think with the Scottish consultation, Edinburgh County Council proposed that it was just lowered completely, and I know that's what the activists want. They want any child to be able to legally change their sex at whatever age. That's the goal. But if the government do progress to a system of self-ID without the need for a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, that has a massive, massive impact. They say that the NHS pathway is something different to the legal system, and they've got nothing to do with each other. Well, of course they have. The NHS works under a framework, an equality and human rights framework. If the government is officially, what they'll be doing is officially sort of ratifying the concept, the idea, the ideology of gender identity. If you can just change your sex by signing a form and saying, I identify as a woman. So in ratifying that idea and legalising that idea, the NHS can't help but recognise that because it gives people rights. So I want to talk about how actually the Gender Recognition Act, the people that was designed to support, it's changed out of all recognition with the government proposals for the reforms of the Gender Recognition Act. So the initial group of people who were supported were transsexuals who were diagnosed with gender dysphoria, who have a report from a psychiatrist or two medical health professionals, who have lived for 2 years in the role, whatever that means. And that was a recognised condition, transsexuality, gender dysphoria. It was a recognised medical condition, even though we don't really understand it and we don't really know how to diagnose it, at least it is a recognised medical condition. If the government say, well, to change sex, you just have to sign a form without gender dysphoria, the government is saying gender identity is real. Now, gender identity is a made-up concept. There is no scientific evidence that says that all of us human beings have this innate sense of being male or female, which is completely independent of our biological sex and our socialisation. But it's this magic thing. And gender identity was actually born out of queer theory, which came from the academy. So when you hear people saying this is a youth movement, you know, the youth are so progressive and they're teaching us such a lot, it's not. It came from the academy. Youth have taken it on, but they were taught this theory by adults. And this academic queer theory and identity politics basically proposes that biological sex is a constructed idea, social construct, and gender identity is real and innate and fixed, and that's the material reality. And in fact, queer theory says that everything is a social construct, except queer theory. It's so mad, but what the government will be doing actually is sort of legalising queer theory, or setting up a society based on the ideology of queer theory. And queer theory is madness, and I think that's what we're teaching our children, is madness. But already we're looking at a system, and when I talk to people and they say, just self-identifying your sex, that's crazy, you know, just deciding which sex you are. But I want to draw people's attention to the fact that children are already or the system in schools is already a system of self-defined sex. So, and this is what the transgender organisations and Stonewall have been teaching in schools. Certainly gendered intelligence have been going into schools since 2008. And they are making sure that there are no sex-based exemptions in schools. Their guidance states that trans pupils should be able to use the toilets and changing rooms that match their gender identity, to join in the sports that match their gender identity, on overnight accommodation, to sleep in the dormitories that match their gender identity. And this is not equality law. This is not what equality law says. About toilets and changing rooms, the only advice for schools from the Equality and Human Rights Commission in their technical guidance is that the trans child should be found some alternative facilities, not that the trans child should be able to use the facilities of the opposite sex. So wherever we see an organisation changing their policies, such as girl guiding, they have inevitably been advised by a transgender organisation or by Stonewall. But what we're seeing, the big scandal in the girl guides, what's happening there, exactly the same is happening in schools. And schools, of course, I mean, teachers don't know, do they? Not many of us really know the ins and outs of equality law. And it's actually very complicated in this area when you're looking at balancing the rights of the gender reassignment protected characteristic and the sex protected characteristic. But what the Gender Recognition Act did was it actually set gender identity as the default, even though that's not a protected characteristic. In our sex segregated services, the default in reality is that our services are now divided by gender identity and not sex. That is the default position. If we want to continue having those services segregated by sex, which is the only logical reason to separate them for privacy and dignity of both sexes and for the safety of women and girls, we have to, service providers have to invoke exemptions. Now, all single-sex services, including in schools, on the high street, and refuges everywhere, all of those were set up as a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. None of them were set up as a disproportionate means of achieving an illegitimate aim. You know, that they were already, that division by sex should be the default. It should be the exception that needs to be applied for if somebody wants to identify their way into them. So that's already the wrong way round, and as Women's Place are saying, those sex-based exemptions need to be strengthened if we're going to, well, they need to be strengthened anyway. But the organisations who are going into schools and they are teaching bad facts or inaccurate facts about equality law are Gendered Intelligence and Stonewall, who are the organisations who advise girl guiding, and also Mermaids, who have been given funding by the Department for Education to go into schools. Now, these organisations believe already that a boy who identifies as a girl was literally born female. That is the belief of the people who run these organisations. I don't know if any of you saw Susie Green of Mermaids on, was it this morning, the other morning? There's been so much on recently. I think it was the other morning, Susie Green was on and was saying about girl guiding, but they are girls. They are girls. But in fact, they're not. They're boys who identify as girls. But that is the belief. And that is the belief on which they base their schools' guidance and policies. So children are being also taught through this school's guidance. They are being taught queer theory. They are being taught to mistrust reality, to not understand reality at an age, I mean from kindergarten onwards, at an age when children have not yet learned to distinguish between fantasy and reality. So these organisations are sweeping out from under the carpet any sense of reality, and a really important reality, because it's the reality of who I am. We are our bodies. We can't get away from our bodies, but children are being taught that our self is a separate thing to our bodies. And so children are being coached into a state of gender dysphoria, disassociation from the body, which is a sign of mental ill health. I mean, you know, the connection with mind and body, the acceptance of reality is an indicator of good mental health. And these organisations are teaching children the opposite. They're teaching them disassociation, and they're teaching them to reject their bodies and actually have a lifetime of rejection of their bodies. This is the opposite of what we should be teaching children in schools: to accept their bodies, to use their bodies, to know what their bodies can do, to feel comfortable in their bodies. Body acceptance and body positivity, and this completely goes against all of that kind of teaching. So why has this happened in schools? This started around 2008. Gendered Intelligence, I know, started going into schools. I don't know whether they're going in any earlier than that, but when we look at this, that astronomical increase, that 4,400% increase in referrals to the Tavistock, and as you said, that's just the tip of the iceberg. If you're a parent now and you have a child at school, you ask them, there will be a cluster of girls in their school who are binding their breasts and planning their double mastectomies, while we all cheer on. So over that decade, that is the decade that this information has been given to children in schools, and basically what children have been taught is a new way to conceptualise their non-conformity, because of course it's the non-conforming children who will start to think, maybe actually I identify with the boys, that's not such a jump to identify as a boy. And adults are pushing children towards making that jump. So in schools, it's we need to, you know, and I'm hoping that Penny Mordaunt will be challenging that material that's going into schools and that's teaching children this. It's interesting that when we produced this guidance, there's a statement out from Stonewall saying it's really harmful to children, and I certainly know that in Warwickshire the head teacher's newsletter contains a warning about this guidance because Stonewall says it's really damaging. I've also heard that Stonewall contacted local education authorities to tell them not to read this guidance. So you'll want to read it later. So there's been a real targeted harassment campaign on Twitter, which has it's been going on for a couple of years, but it's really increased since this was published, so they really want to stop this material being seen by teachers. And to me, anybody who's working with children, they don't behave like that. they don't. They're not really nasty to people on Twitter. They don't try and, they don't say ban it, burn it, shred it. They don't behave like that. Sort of childcare professionals. They just don't. And that shows to me that this is a political activist movement. Transgender itself is a political word. It's meaningless. Gendered intelligence defines it as from transvestites and cross-dressers through to people who don't conform to gender norms. It's transgender. It has no meaning, unlike transsexual, which did have a meaning. It did have a recognised meaning. Transgender really has no meaning. It's a political label, and children have been made into political pawns and are being treated as members of a political group advancing political rights, not as children suffering from gender dysphoria, gender confusion, and often underlying mental health issues, previous trauma, past sexual abuse, a lot of kids from care homes with troubled backgrounds. We're not looking at any of that. We're not looking at the safeguarding of individual children, but we're looking at them as a political entity. And this is what these groups have done in education. I will quickly go on to health because if the government really sort of ratifies that idea of gender identity, I think parents won't be able to challenge schools on this. I think now we can, now's the time, pick up some packs and go into your children's schools. I think if the government say self-ID, then I don't think we've got a leg to stand on in schools, because the guidance from Stonewall, etc., reflects that, and it won't be able to be questioned. In terms of health and the path for children, I think I need to hurry up. I think I've got a little bit of time left. Health-wise, okay, the same thing. Wrap it up. The same thing has happened. We are stacking all the odds against children desisting from gender dysphoria, as most children do when we left them alone, when we didn't affirm them and tell little boys that, yes, you really are a girl, or tell girls, yes, you really are literally a boy. Before we started doing that, around 80% of children naturally grew out of gender dysphoria, became resolved during puberty, and a large proportion of those children grew up to be gay or lesbian. Particularly the prepubertal boys, there's a larger percentage grow up to be gay than the prepubertal girls. It's a little less with them. So what's happened in health is that the UK Council of Psychotherapy has issued a memorandum of understanding on conversion therapy, and as you pointed, added gender identity to it. So not only have we invented gender identity, we are now saying that gender identity is akin to sexual orientation. Now, sexual orientation exists. I think we all have a sexual orientation. I think we're all quite accepting to admit that we have a sexual orientation, but gender identity is imposed. I think very few of us, actually, if we really know what that means, will accept that we have a gender identity. We know that we're women, we know that we're men, but do we have this internal, deep essence? I think most people would probably actually reject that. That's an imposed identity. But what that gender identity does is that it makes us all a gender identity. It forces us to also be a gender identity. So those words like cisgender or self-identified woman, we women ourselves are forced to use those terms and forced to define ourselves as a gender identity, to differentiate ourselves from trans, we must be cisgender. So therefore, I identify as a woman. And you will see that that's happening by the way that, so for example, in my little town, the local cinema had a women-only viewing, and they broadcast it by saying women only, all self-identified women are eligible. And unless we say I identify as a woman, we can't go. Because, you know, that excludes me, because I don't identify as a woman. So the use of language is very clever. What that has done in health is it means that we must only affirm a child's gender identity, or we, as a therapist may be accused of conversion therapy if they give a child therapeutic support to explore the issues, why they identify as they do, and what the underlying issues are. So children are being absolutely denied the normal duty of care in exploring a range of mental health issues, actually, because therapists are too afraid to work with those kids as they need working with, in case they then manage their gender dysphoria and desist from their trans identity. That's too big a risk for therapists. So in every area of society, we've stacked up all the odds against children desisting. Trans is trans, it's intrinsic, it's a gender identity, and it's become a political act to go against that. These children are made into political activists for a cause themselves. So this proposed change in the Gender Recognition Act will really validate all that. It's an enormous, enormous risk for children, and just don't forget that when you're filling in the gender recognition consultation. Please, even though there's not a box asking you this, that the age for a gender recognition certificate should not be lowered, and that this whole concept of gender identity is a great risk to children. Thank you.